Eran las 3 de la mañana, 3 de enero en el calendario. Caracas dormía tranquila bajo su manto diario, pero el cielo no trajo sol, trajo un ruido de metal, y en Fuerte Tiuna se rompió el silencio habitual. No fueron truenos de lluvia, fueron botas extranjeras que cruzaron sin permiso nuestras líneas y fronteras. La noticia corre como pólvora, la pantalla se congela. Se han llevado al presidente, hay fuego en Venezuela. Liberen a Nicolás, grita una parte del mapa, mientras la garra del norte su sentencia destapa. Dicen que va hacia el norte sobre el mar prisionero, en las entrañas de acero de un buque extranjero. Que el mundo se detenga, que nadie quede mudo, hoy la historia se parte. Liberen a Maduro. Hoy en Moscú escuchas el eco en el Caribe. Si cae un socio, el equilibrio no sobrevive. Pekín levanta la vista, el dragón debe mirar que las flotas del imperio han vuelto a navegar. Hermano en La Habana, sandinista en Nicaragua, saben que esta misma lluvia mañana será su agua. Si hoy tocan a uno y lo sacan de su cama, mañana su justicia incendiará toda la rama. Dicen que el Iwo Jima navega con la presa, que van rumbo a Nueva York a servirlo en la mesa. Trump firma la orden, Petro mira con espanto. ¿Es justicia o es venganza lo que cubre con su manto? Las bombas en la Carlota dejaron su marca en el suelo. Un pájaro de hierro se lo llevó en pleno vuelo. Para el que celebra en Miami, para el que llora en el barrio, esto no es solo un hombre, es un cambio de escenario. La soberanía sangra cuando el juez es el verdugo, y la libertad no nace bajo la sombra del yugo. Venezolano, despierta, sea cual sea tu color. Hoy tu tierra fue pisada por la bota del invasor. El mundo aguanta la respiración, la moneda está en el aire. Nadie sabe el costo, nadie sabe el desaire. Desde el sur hasta el oriente, el mensaje es duro. Me respetan a los pueblos, me liberen a Maduro. Me respetan a los pueblos, me liberen a Maduro.
It is our duty and our responsibility as our political vision and our charge to learn from the Cuban Revolution. We refuse to settle for a false peace when the Bureau just reported that Peruvians are impacted by the actions of the U.S. government. We refuse to compromise in the face of orchestrated genocide. We refuse to be defeated. Just as they will not blockade the sun, they will not blockade our solidarity. Let the imperialists hold on to their crumbs, but we, the people, will piece together. We vow to work alongside together in the U.S. across borders and political lines to get our people free and to follow the sovereign human model of revolutionary struggle. We vow to raise their political consciousness and make sure they call and work towards no war on Cuba, no war on Cuba, no war on Cuba.
I'm muted. Hopefully you could hear me. If you cannot hear me, let me know in the chat. If you just see my mouth moving and no sound, I'll fix it. But that was Shaquille, one of the co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, speaking at a international conference organized for International Workers' Day in Havana, Cuba, talking about the necessity of steadfast solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, the need to defend the example of the Cuban Revolution, and you are watching the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast. My name is Onya Sanu, one of your hosts, another co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. There's 5 of us in total, elected, unpaid, in it for the love of the game and the love of the Cuban Revolution, and the understanding that we as citizens of the U.S. empire have a responsibility to organize in defense of the Cuban Revolution and against all U.S. government attacks to destroy the Cuban Revolution and to destroy the Cuban people's revolutionary project. This show happens every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We started it about 2 months ago, and the intent of this program is to engage in that battle of ideas, engage in that military revolutionary media war, because we understand the capitalists, the imperialists, the Trumps, the Bezos, the Musks, they have dominated capitalist media for a long time. They lie about Cuba constantly. They literally cannot help themselves. And so progressive forces, people that believe in justice, people that know the truth about Cuba, have a responsibility to elevate our voices, to create platforms where we can disseminate the truth, where we can talk about what is going on in the grassroots Cuba Solidarity movement. And so we can build deeper our analysis, build our plans to tighten up our strategy. So that is what this show is about. And usually there are 3 hosts, myself and my comments, Jasenia and Ermia. But Jasenia and Ermia are in the liberated territory of Cuba with the May Day Brigade this week and also last week. So today you're just getting me, and the comments will be back to talk about the brigade in more detail next week. Also, before I move on, I want to talk about what we're going to be discussing today. And I also want to talk about, I want to try a new thing in the opening, like this date, what happened on this day in Cuban history. So we're going to do that in a second. But I'll say, as our little intro, is that the song that was playing at Nicolas is about the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. And the U.S. Earlier this year have been held in 4 months on completely made up charges in the New York Metropolitan Detention Center for quite a while. Nicolas Maduro specifically was denied access to funds to pay for his lawyer, because Venezuela is suffering under U.S. sanctions. The U.S. government, that again is charging him with made up crimes that we're going to talk about a little bit today as we talk about Show of the Americas, also said, well, you know, you're sanctioned, so you can't, the Venezuelan government cannot pay for your lawyer, but also he's in solitary confinement and he's not allowed to talk to anybody. So how else is he going to get money? That's the U.S. government effectively trying to cut off his legal defense. And again, a case based on made up charges. It is heinous. It is a farce, and it needs to be resisted at every level across all movements, because like it says in the song, the rain that falls in Venezuela today is going to fall on the rest of us tomorrow unless we do something about it. What happens to Venezuela today, they are trying to do to Cuba, they're trying to do to Nicaragua, they're trying to the Alliance of Sahel states, they're currently doing to Palestine. So we have to unite across struggles and fight for the liberation of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores, and understand the different ways that the same enemy is going for all of us. And so that's why we had that song in the opening. So like I said, on the agenda for today's episode, we're going to go deep into the Shield of the Americas, the gathering of the ops of the Americas that the Trump administration pulled together in Florida, of course, in Florida, because let me tell you, the most reactionary diasporas are gathered, clustered here. I live in Seminole Territory in Central Florida, Orlando, Florida. And South Florida is where a lot of them are, but really across the states, the most reactionary members of the diasporas from the Caribbean and Central and South America are concentrated here in Florida. And so that's why they be doing this shit here. But there's also resistance and people that support the Cuban Revolution and people that support progressive forces across Turtle Island here as well, fighting for power. And so that's important to mention. But the Shield of the Americas Summit was held in March, and we're going to talk about what that means, the implications of that, and the historical parallels, because it's not new. It's not new. It is a rehash of a very old strategy of U.S. imperialism. But this day in Cuban revolutionary history, it is May 8th, 2026. It is a week after International Workers' Day. And this day on Cuban revolutionary history, 2 things happen. One very positive thing one thing that just illustrates, again, the raggediness, the violence of U.S. imperialism, and specifically how U.S. imperialism attacks Cuba. So on May 8th, 1960, Cuba and the USSR officially established diplomatic relations. Shout out to solidarity between socialist revolutionary projects. Shout out to the USSR, gone but not forgotten, made its contribution to the global revolutionary struggle, and certainly helped Cuba survive the initial period of the US blockade and the Cold War, until, of course, the US helped destroy the USSR. The USSR fell and was forced to abandon Cuba for a little while. But what was happening when Cuba and the USSR decided to establish formal diplomatic relations on this day in 1960 was that the US government under President Eisenhower had already started what would become the US blockade on Cuba. They had initiated an oil blockade on Cuba. They said, oh, you want to overturn our puppet? You want to start nationalizing things? You want land reform? Well, we're not going to send you oil anymore. And at that time, the U.S. was Cuba's primary supplier of oil. And so the intent of that oil blockade is the same as the intent of the oil blockade now, to attempt to cause suffering among the Cuban people, to cut them off from basic resources, to attempt to starve out the revolution. So that's one thing that was happening. And then also the Eisenhower administration said they were no longer going to buy sugar from Cuba. And again, another attempt to cut Cuba off from income. And so at that point, the US blockade on Cuba was not legally codified in the way it is now, but the Eisenhower administration was already making the moves that would become codified in US policy in the successive administrations up until the present day. And Cuba understood, even back then, the need to start building those international ties with other nations, building socialism, other nations resisting imperialism. And so that's why they were like, okay, well, if the US is not going to help us. Like, I think Castro traveled to the US to try to meet with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower just would not meet with him because he was let me not swear, he sucked. So instead, that Cuba turned to the USSR and other anti-imperialist nations, and the rest is history. The other thing that happened on this day, on May 8th, 1980, is counter-revolutionaries in the Marianao neighborhood of Havana set fire to a preschool. It was called the Levantam Preschool. It was on the ground floor of a 10-story building in the Marianao neighborhood in Havana. And they basically targeted children to attempt to destabilize the Cuban Revolution. They set this preschool on fire. The fire spread quickly up the stairwells and throughout the building. But the Cuban people, the heroic and organized Cuban people, including students that attended a high school in the building, as well as people from the community around the building, as well as, of course, firefighters from the Cuban government, launched a rescue operation immediately and started getting the kids out of the building, getting everybody out of the building. It was 570 students and over 150 staff members in this building that counter-revolution they set on fire. But because of the organization and heroism of those students, those firefighters, those neighbors, community members, and also Fidel Castro himself came out, the fire was quickly put out. All the children and staff members were gotten out safely, and no one died. But what this shows you is a couple of things. One, that civilians are the most consistent target of US imperialist attacks on Cuba. Marco Rubio said earlier this week that the blockade on Cuba is not about attacking civilians, it's about attacking the Cuban government, and the Cuban government is hurting the Cuban people, but the civilians aren't being touched. That has never been the intent. The Mallory Memorandum makes it completely clear that this specific target has always been civilians, for starvation, for acts of terrorism, like trying to burn down a preschool, like for the economic strangulation, the listing on the SSOT that cuts Cuba off from funds. All of the intent of all of those tactics has always been to hurt regular people in Cuba. It always has been, it always will be, because that's all they got. Just like the Zionist entity in occupied Palestine, when they cannot defeat you politically and militarily, they always go for the unarmed and defenseless, because they can't win against the people that can actually fight back. So instead, they're going to go for preschoolers. That is what they be doing. That is how imperialism functions. So again, just an example of the depths to which imperialism will sink, the systematic targeting of civilian populations, particularly children, and also the organization, heroism, and resilience of the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution to face all of these different kinds of attacks on their revolutionary project, to figure out how to show up for each other, how to save each other, and how to keep moving forward regardless. So yeah, the counter-revolution will always fail, no matter how many times you try, because the Cubans will refuse to be colonized, and the revolution is winning. Suck it. Maybe that was not professional, but I am not necessarily a professional person. Anyway, so let's talk about the escalation of the US war on Cuba that has been happening this week. I don't mean to smile, I'm just a cheeky person. Anyway, updates on US attacks on Cuba. So, like we shared on the program last week, and I say we, and it was just me, but I'm using it as like the communist we. Like, you know, there's like the royal we. This is the communist we, the collective. So last week on the program, we talked about how Cuba had recently figured out how to refine its own crude oil, the crude oil that Cuba itself produces, that it does not have to import. They figured out how to make diesel from it, how to make gas from it. It was a really big deal. Then they had thousands of mobilizations across the island, people coming in brigades from all over the world, and support, including from the US, organized by the NNOC, in support of the Cuban Revolution, converged on Cuba for International Workers' Day. There were massive marches in support of the Cuban Revolution. And at that moment, that is when the US government, the Trump administration, chose to release another executive order on May 1st. On May 1st, applying additional sanctions, not just on the Cuban government, but on any entity around the world that tries to work with Cuba. So they're not just targeting Cuban civilians with the blockade now. They are also, and this is not new, but they're extending it. They are also applying it to companies in completely other countries, not the US, not Cuba, who try to work with Cuba, and also people who work for those companies. And another thing that the executive order said was that they don't have to warn you. They can cut off your access to the international banking system, and they don't have to give you any heads up. So I'm gonna actually, I think I can put the executive order on the screen. So I'm gonna do that right now. And hopefully you can still see me so I can talk about it a little bit more. All right, let me know if that worked. It looks like it worked. So this is the latest executive order released by the Trump administration on May 1st. So last week, I also just put the link in the chat if you want to look at it yourself. It's called Imposing Sanctions on Those Responsible for Repression in Cuba and for Threats to the United States National Security and Foreign Policy. And again, like I said, essentially what this executive order does is go after anybody that attempts to do business with Cuba, that attempts to engage in trade with Cuba, whether they live in the United States, whether they live in Cuba, or whether they live in another country entirely, such as Canada, for example, and say that they can be sanctioned by the US government if they operate in energy, defense and related materials, mining, financial services, or other security sector of the Cuban economy. And so like I mentioned, Cuba figured out how to refine its own crude oil, produce gasoline and diesel and other necessary supplies from its own crude oil through refining it. And then they had International Workers' Day, this like uplifting of the Cuban Revolution, this like commitment, like recommitting to defending it. And this is what the US chooses to do. They put it out on May 1st on International Workers' Day, and then they specifically target energy, defense and related materials, metals and mining, financial services. That is very intentional. They are trying to identify any place where Cuba is innovating to resist US attacks and then launch a new attack there. This is like extremely targeted, extremely intentional. So the fallout from this was pretty quick, which is usually what happens. Companies are not trying to risk being fined or sanctioned by the US government. They are not trying to get their bank accounts frozen. And so they will throw Cuba to the wolves in order to save themselves, in order to be able to continue to do business with the much larger market of the United States. And so that happened like almost immediately. So there's a Canadian company that is the largest processor of Cuban nickel and cobalt. It's called Sherritt Mining. It also does some oil processing in Cuba. Earlier this week, they announced that they were immediately shutting down their operations in Cuba And the folks that were responsible for leading those operations are resigning. And it's clear what the implication of that is. They actually say it directly in the press release about this that I just dropped in the chat. They said the decisive factor was the implementation of secondary sanctions on foreign financial institutions dealing with blocked Cuban entity, a measure including the executive order signed by Trump on May 1st, which directly threatened Sherrod's access to the international banking system. So even before it was made clear who was going to be directly impacted by this, companies doing business in Cuba started like doing their own calculations to be like, oh God, are we gonna get got by this? And then they were like, it's not worth it. We need our bank account. We need to do business internationally. So we're just gonna pull out of Cuba. It's a small market. Well, at least we'll have all the other markets. That's exactly what the intent of the executive order was, to intimidate companies into dropping these key sectors of Cuba's economy to turn the screws on the Cuban people even more. So again, immediate consequences, and there will be more, and this is the intent. Another thing that happened earlier this week is that Marco Rubio gave a press conference where he identified additional specific entities that are going to be targeted for U.S. sanctions. One of those entities is the Grupo de Administración Empresarial, also known as GAISA, which has actually been sanctioned by the U.S. government before, but like Gusanos are convinced that if GAISA is destroyed, the backbone of the Cuban socialist economy will be destroyed for conquering and for imposing capitalism. They've been saying that for a long time, and in fact, GAISA was already on the restricted list, which lists entities that people from the United States are not allowed to do business with in Cuba. Like a lot of hotels are on there, a lot of resorts are on there, but also like a lot of Cuban national enterprises and organizations are on there. So that had already been the case. Announced additional sanctions today. What is this? Is this like my, oh, it's my webcam cover. It is what it is. Announced additional sanctions on GAISA today, on the organization itself as a whole, but then also on this person. And you should like a person name. And I'm gonna try to fix it because when you see like an individual person's name, I should have let me take it out. When you see an individual person's name on like economic sanctions, like understand like that person's like bank account gets shut down if they have bank accounts. That person cannot open new bank accounts. That person gets put on all kinds of watch lists. It basically cuts off their access to income and drastically restricts their free movements in places that are subordinate to the United States. Like they actually did this. I don't know if folks have been following, but like the US government has sanctioned journalists and members of the International Criminal Court for exposing or trying to hold the Zionist entity accountable for its crimes of genocide and settler colonialism. Instead of holding the Zionist entity accountable, the US chooses to go for the people that are trying to stop the genocide. And so that like, it's literally like members, like people that work at the ICC who cannot like even get money out of their ATM to buy food. Like that's what it looks like. So when you see like an individual person's name being sanctioned, like understand like it's a really intentionally intense impact on their day-to-day life. And this is what they're trying to do to this comrade that's been named specifically in the sanctions, but also to folks that work with Cuba and work with Cuban enterprises. So again, this is the intent. They're trying to starve out the Cuban people. They're trying to destabilize key industries in the Cuban economy. They're trying to turn the screws, intensify the situation so much in Cuba that Cuban people rise up and overthrow their revolution. It has not happened for 70 years at this point. It's not going to happen, but the reality is that it's having drastic and dire consequences on the Cuban people. And they are resilient, they are heroic, they are extremely educated, organized, and militarily trained, which is why the dictatorship allegations are absurd because they could take care of that if it really was a dictatorship. But it's also important to understand that being systematically denied access to resources in like this escalated manner, particularly since the first Trump administration, is creating an increasingly unlivable situation, which is why we see so many people fleeing Cuba, not because they want to leave their home, but because the US is creating a completely unsustainable situation, is intentionally creating destructive and chaotic conditions in Cuba. So Trump and Rubio said, there's also happening, in addition to like the escalation of the economic attacks on Cuba, Trump has continued to make comments about exercising military intervention against Cuba, invading Cuba, kidnapping Diaz-Canel, reconquering it, colonizing it for U.S. imperialism, for Western imperialism. The most recent remarks were just a few days ago. He was giving a speech in Florida. Of course, and he mused about how Cuba was going to fall at any time, how the U.S. could take it at any moment. And he talked about sending I think it was like the USS Abraham Lincoln, a warship that is currently deployed in West Asia to antagonize Iran. He floated the idea of that ship returning to the Western Hemisphere, sailing to just off the coast of Cuba and intimidating the Cuban government into giving up. And so each time that Trump makes threats like this, the intent is psychological warfare. They are heightening the economic attacks to increase the day-to-day suffering of the Cuban people. And at the same time, they are consistently threatening military intervention, pointing at what happened to Venezuela, signaling their intent to do the same thing to Cuba, to attempt to make people scared, to attempt to make them capitulate, to give up. But it's really important for us to stay focused, to stay organized, to refuse to panic, to understand that their paired tactics of executive warfare or economic warfare and psychological warfare, and not help them do it. Do not help them do it. Stay focused, stay organized, understand the stakes, understand people are very, very irrational, but look at like the current conditions on the ground. And the current conditions on the ground is that the majority of the U.S. military forces have been deployed to West Asia in an attempt to antagonize Iran, to overthrow the Iranian government. That has not happened. They have been mollywopped, just destroyed. In fact, the Washington Post, no less than the media wing of the Bezos empire, right wing as hell, even the right wing as hell, Bezos owned Washington Post this week put out an article announcing that the destruction to U.S. military targets across West Asia caused by Iran's very targeted attacks was much more extensive than the Trump administration has ever admitted. The same administration, Pete Hegseth and Trump, will get on the mic every couple of days and say Iran has no more missiles, their military has been wiped out, their Navy has been wiped out. And I feel like every single time they say that, like 5 minutes later, we hear about Iran striking another ship or another target with more missiles. The reality of the situation, and the New York Times acknowledges this too, is that the majority of Iran's military capacity, its capacity to defend itself, remains intact. They are lying. And they lost a vast amount of their military infrastructure across that region. They were scrambling, pulling resources from Asia, from all over the world to attempt to fight back. And now they use so many missiles. They only make like a limited quantity of Tomahawks a year, and they use like the majority of their supply. And now they're asking for more money because they know that Iran can even withstand a naval blockade for months, but the U.S. does not have that many resources to withstand it themselves. And so it's just like they're trying to project invincibility all over the world. They're trying to project that they can fight a war in West Asia. They can intimidate the Turtle Island, the Caribbean. They can be off the coast of China, antagonizing China, trying to use Taiwan as cannon fodder. They're trying to convince everybody they can be everywhere at once, but they don't actually have unlimited resources. And they drastically miscalculated how things were going to go in Iran. And they're still trying to figure out what to do about it, how they fix this, how to get out of it. Like, they don't have the good sense to just give up. They don't. They're trying to save face for some reason, but they also recognize that they have painted themselves into a corner. And so that material reality means that they have less capacity to antagonize Cuba at this point. And that won't always be that way. But at this point, despite what Trump says, to try to get Cubans and right-wing diasporas in Florida to clap for him, to try to intimidate and scare people, despite what they say, the reality is they have miscalculated and overextended themselves, and they have not recovered yet. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind as I try to identify like what strategy we use to move forward. Don't reinforce the psychological warfare. Be clear about what the U.S. is and what it's capable of, but also look at the material conditions so that we can develop scientific strategies that are going to allow us to be the most effective in this moment without, again, panicking or reinforcing the tactics of the enemy. Like an example of what I mean is Marco Rubio went to Florida to meet with the leaders of Southcom, the U.S. military Southern Command, which is responsible for like U.S. colonial ventures across, oh my God, someone's talking about their stock prices. Dog, I don't know about any of that nonsense. Across U.S. like colonial occupation of Turtle Island, basically of this hemisphere. Like that's what Southcom is for, and CENTCOM is about antagonizing West Asia. AFRICOM is about Africa. They have it all over. They have covered the planet in these military commands, and all it is about is colonial control. Southcom is for the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. So Marco Rubio went to Southcom, had meetings with leaders about counterterrorism, narco-terrorism operations, and then also did a photo op with one of the leaders where they're like shaking hands in front of a map of Cuba, and then like they posted that, and I was like, you people, like this is clearly just like throwing red meat at these like unhinged right-wing Cubans and diasporas in Florida, because they always be doing this shit in Florida. Like they're trying to pander to that base and again project force, project military dominance, project intent to invade Cuba. But I think it's again just like a show at this point. And again, not to say that it won't be it's not a possibility that the U.S. is not capable of it, but just to say, looking at like the conditions and where things are actually at, it to me seems more like narrative control and psychological warfare than actual like strategizing to do this imminently. Okay, oh yeah, and then another thing that Marco Rubio said, because they're also like trying to develop like the political and legal pretext for military intervention in Cuba. Like they're trying to like probe and find weaknesses in like ways that they can do it. And so like each executive order where they escalate sanctions on Cuba, they always talk about Cuba being a national security threat to the United States, that Cuba is supposedly hosting military bases for powers antagonistic to the United States. Not true. And also if they were, they have the right, who are y'all? But also saying that Cuba has provided support to Hezbollah, to Hamas, and to adversaries of the United States, which as they should. Hezbollah is the only thing standing behind the Lebanese people and further expansion of the settler colonial Zionist project. They are the armed resistance against the expansion of the Zionist project into Lebanon. And then Hamas is the main armed resistance of the Palestinian people to extermination. So not just Cuba, but many social justice and social justice oriented and anti-imperialist nations around the world also support the just resistance of the Lebanese and Palestinian people. That's not a national security threat. That is fighting for social justice, fighting for liberation. So each executive order accuses Cuba of this and tries to frame it as a national security threat to the United States. And so Marco Rubio is like peddling that narrative in the media to try to like build that pretext of Cuba as a threat, to try to provide some kind of justification for military intervention. But he's also saying, because reporters are starting to ask, like, this oil blockade, like this cutting off of Cuba's access to fuel to put in generators, that's causing like blackouts, that's causing hospitals and schools and homes for elders and disabled folks to scramble for resources, to scramble to help people. This maximum pressure campaign and the escalation of the sanctions is causing like very serious issues for the Cuban people. And Marco Rubio tried to fix his face to say earlier this week that the Cuban people are not the target, that the blockade does not hurt them, that the blockade on Cuba is really about hurting the communists. The communists are not the people. It's bullshit. It's nonsense. It's not true. First of all, the Mallory Memorandum makes it completely clear that the intent of the U.S. blockade on Cuba is to cause so much suffering among the Cuban people that they rise up and overthrow their own government. That is the intent. Cause suffering among the Cuban people because they love socialism and the revolution so much that they won't turn against it without that. So we already know that's the strategy. But second of all, there are so many independent measures of the impact of this oil blockade and of the maximum pressure campaign initiated by the Trump administration in 2016. In fact, earlier this week, The Center for Economic and Policy, actually it wasn't this week, it was on April 27th. The Center for Economic and Policy Research put out this study whose title is U.S. Sanctions and the Sharp Rise in Infant Mortality in Cuba. And in that study, what the CEPR says is that the maximum pressure campaign, that's the U.S. sanctions on Cuba, have increased infant mortality in Cuba by 148%. They went from 4.4 deaths per birth, per thousand births in Cuba, to 9.9 deaths per thousand live births in Cuba, just since 2020. The maximum pressure campaign started in 2016. This is a direct study, like breaks it down. They have receipts. This drastic increase in infant mortality in Cuba is a direct consequence of the escalation of U.S. sanctions, of that maximum pressure campaign. So tell me, are these babies that are dying because of the escalation of this economic warfare, are those communists? Are those leaders of the Cuban government? Are those people in power oppressing regular Cubans? Or are they babies? Like I said at the beginning of the show, that civilians are the intentional target, and you can tell because they always go for the kids. They go for the defenseless people that cannot fight back, intentionally, systematically. As a matter of fact, when the U.S. and Zionist entity aggression on Iran started, and the first thing they did was bomb a school and kill over 150 little girls, that I don't buy for a second that was an accident. Not with the intelligence apparatus that the United States had. You could see on Google Maps. So there's no way they didn't know. They did that. Target defenseless populations is some of the cursed shock strategy. They always have. They do it in Cuba. They do it in Palestine. They do it in Iran. They do it all over the world. It's an intentional strategy. It's an intentional strategy. So Marco Rubio fixing his face to say the civilians are not the target. He is bald-faced lying, as he does about many things. That's just who he is as a person, but do not buy it. And also another narrative. So right-wing Cubans, like you see it every time, about all the positive work happening. You get angry about that. No blockade. There is no blockade. You haven't been there in 15 years. And they always say there is no blockade. There is no blockade. But the receipts. The year the Cuban government submits a report to the United Nations documenting the impact of the U.S. blockade on Cuba and the impact on civilians. So many independent entities, like not even communist or socialist entities, like the CEPR, it's not communist or socialist. It's like liberal. It's like neoliberal. But even they can clearly see the impact on civilians of the blockade. It's like alternative history that these right-wing Cubans are pushing. The reality is civilians are the target. They are intentionally the target. They always have been. And also, it's not communism that's causing these drastic and dire economic conditions for Cuban civilians, because they have gotten worse with the intentional escalation of the U.S. blockade on Cuba, initiated by the Trump administration in 2016. Or when the Trump administration started in 2016, particularly when the COVID pandemic hit. Cuba was forced to shut down tourism for the safety of its population, and the Trump administration used that opportunity when Cuba was sending doctors all over the world to help fight a global pandemic. The Trump administration used that opportunity to initiate a maximum pressure campaign. They put Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Obama had taken them off. Trump put them back on, and the impact of that listing on the state sponsors of terrorism is that Cuba was immediately cut off from access to the international banking system. They could not get dollars. They could not get loans. They could not open bank accounts. That was the intent. To cut them off from resources, from liquid cash, so they could not meet the needs of their citizens. And then Trump put even more additional sanctions in that maximum pressure campaign. Trump left office. Biden came in, left them all in place, except for like that 5 minutes on the last day when he took Cuba off that SOT right before. And then Trump came back in and immediately put them back on it. Trump cut every aspect of the maximum pressure campaign in place, even imposed additional sanctions on some of the same entities that the Trump administration has sanctioned. And then Trump came back in, kept the maximum pressure campaign, kept the escalations from Biden in place, and then put even more escalation in place. So now in the present day, when we have blackouts across Havana, when we have a drastic shortage of oil, when we have like these like intense conditions that people are forced to flee in Cuba, understand this was intentionally and systematically created. It is not the failure of communism, it is the impact of US imperialism, specifically and intentionally targeting civilians. So yeah. But it's not all bad news, because like I said on the last show, every single time, I don't know why I clicked that by accident, because I was like, ooh. Every single time the US government escalates the US blockade on Cuba, the Cuban Revolution and the global Cuba Solidarity Movement responds with innovation, responds with organization. So the US said, we're going to cut off your oil. Cuba was like, bet, we're going to use revolutionary science, baby, to figure out how to refine our own oil. And we're also going to initiate an extremely rapid and wide transition to solar power, because you cannot blockade the sun. The US government said that we're going to try to intimidate governments all across the region into cutting ties with Cuba. So the global Cuba Solidarity Movement said, bet, we are going to send thousands of people and ships and pounds of material aid to Cuba to show that Cuba is not alone. They zig, we zag. So important to understand that the resistance in Cuba continues. And so I have some videos from the comrades on the ground in the May Day Brigade who attended the International Workers' Day March in Havana, and also some video from an exchange with Cuban youth and members of the May Day Brigade talking about the goals of those Cuban youth for the future. So I'm going to play those videos back to back, and then we're going to come back and talk about the Shield of the Americas.
We're here in Revolution Square for International Workers' Day. We, the U.S. delegation, are here in Cuba demanding an end to the war on Cuba, to remove Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list, and to end the propaganda war on Cuba and the Cuban Every day we recognize that Cuba is under siege by the imperialist powers, but especially today, as workers of the world unite from all delegations from all over the world. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no.
What do you want to be when you grow up? How do you want to contribute to society?
¿Qué quisieran ser cuando crezcan? ¿Cómo creen que pueden ayudar a la sociedad? ¿Qué más?
Que no sean jefes del municipio de estudio para poder ayudar al estudio en nuestro país y que se pueda extender a los demás países para que puedan ser gratis los estudios y no tengan que pagarlo los alumnos de otros países.
He would like to study pedagogy and to help people to understand that education should be free, not only in Cuba but in the rest of the world.
Blockade forces you to contend with limited resources. How do you ensure that your students have a quality education?
Aquí vamos alternativa por parte de, bueno, también nos apoyan los padres fundamentalmente nos apoyan los padres directamente. Nosotros tratamos una manera de hacer llegar al estudiante lo más esencial porque realmente es lo que, es como tratar maneras de el poco tiempo que tenemos aprovecharlo al máximo con lo fundamental, con lo que necesitan saber, hacer entender muchas cosas que nos pueden llevar a que el niño crezca un poco más con más de independencia. Sí. Nosotros como venceremos. Vamos a vencer, como dice nuestro madre, patria o muerte venceremos.
Just want to say venceremos, we will win, as Comandante said, as Fidel said, patria o muerte, homeland or death, we will win.
We will win indeed. Thank you so much.
Alrighty, again, that was 2 clips from the comrades on the ground for the U.S. contingent of the International May Day Brigade happening right now. It's about to wrap up. You might have noticed that the first video featured my co-host Ermia, and at the end of the second video was my co-host Jasenia. Both of those comrades are part of the May Day Brigade. But you saw the Cuban people are still turning out by the thousands in support of the Cuban Revolution on International Workers' Day. And the Cuban youth and Cuban teachers and Cuban community members, far from giving up or abandoning their revolution, are in fact thinking about how do we share what we have been able to build collectively together, rooted in the principles of social justice and humanism. How do we share this model with the rest of the world? They're like, how do we make sure that everybody has access to free education, not just us? That is revolutionary humanism. That is collectivism. That is Cuban socialism. Baby, you are not going to beat these people in submission, starve these people into submission. They fought to liberate themselves. They organized collectively to build a better alternative centered on life. They're not going to give that up. So Marco Rubio or some cursed right-wing Cuban can lead them. Are you good? Like, they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. They are educated. They are organized. They are militarily trained. And they are certainly suffering now directly because of the actions of the U.S. government intentionally targeting them to cause suffering, but they are not giving up on their revolution. They're going to fight like Iran fought, baby. If you try to invade Cuba, my odds are on Cuba. My odds are on Cuba. But again, very, very important to understand how the enemy is moving, the tactics of counter-revolution that are unfolding. Just talked in detail about the escalation of economic warfare against Cuba, as well as the psychological warfare tactics that we're seeing unfold, as well as, of course, the probing to see if there's an opportunity or opening for military intervention. There also are moves being made by the counter-revolution on a hemispheric basis, trying to unite reactionary forces across Turtle Island to try to destroy revolutionary examples like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua in our hemisphere. And one of those initiatives, one of those unifying of the ops of Turtle Island is something called the Shield of the Americas. The Shield of the Americas. So the Shield of the Americas, and I'm going to drop a CBS News article that came out on the day that the news broke to the world that these clowns were going to do this. So it was a summit held in Doral, Florida, of course, South Florida, I believe, at like a golf course or like a resort that Trump owns, on March 7th of this year, March 7th, 2026. It happened 1 week, if you're paying attention, after the launch of the war of aggression targeting Iran, initiated by the U.S. government and the Zionist entity, Israel. And as a matter of fact, after Trump gave like his little spiel at the Shield of the Americas summit and posed for like some pictures with the puppets, he immediately had to leave to receive the bodies of U.S. troops that had been killed in the war of aggression against Iran. That was actually, if y'all remember, he got like criticized for wearing a white hat on the tarmac when he was receiving the bodies. That's what that was. And it was immediately after the summit. But the summit was basically a gathering of right-wing political figures and leaders from across Turtle Island. A gathering of the ops of the Americas is what I've started to call it. Basically, ideologically aligned people, like-minded conservatives in the hemisphere, coming together to talk about how they are going to wage counter-revolution together. And actually, the Shield of the Americas came out of the postponement of the 10th Summit of the Americas that happened last fall. I don't know if folks were following, but the Summit of the Americas is a gathering of the nations in the Americas that is dominated by the United States. It's controlled by the United States. It was supposed to be hosted in the Dominican Republic this year. The Dominican Republic, under pressure from the United States, announced that they were going to block Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua from participating in the Summit of the Americas. And in response, Colombia and Mexico said that if Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are blocked, we are not going to come. And the DR was like, dang, because like Mexico and Colombia represent massive economies in Turtle Island. And so they are not participating in the summit, deals a blow to the objectives of the neocolonialists that are running the summit. And so DR was like, okay, they said in November, we're just going to postpone it. We're going to postpone it for now to an undefined date in 2026. And then the Trump administration tried to recover the ashes of the collapsed summit. And instead they gathered this Shield of the Americas, and they only invited the right-wing governments across the Americas. I'll give the list of who was there. From Argentina, we had that guy, Malay, that is tanked tanked the economy of that country and had to like beg with his hat out for a handout, like a bailout from the United States after he made just like a series of cursed right-wing decisions, libertarian decisions about Argentina's economy. Right-wing government leader of Bolivia, president-elect of Chile. The current president of Chile is actually Gabriel Boric, who's like a social democrat. Like he's not like a communist, but he's not right wing. And so Trump was like, we don't want that guy, we want this guy, because Cast is openly right wing and aligned with the Trump administration. So they didn't invite the sitting president of Chile. They invited the incoming president of Chile, who was more ideologically aligned with Trump. Trump from Costa Rica, they had Chavez from the Dominican Republic, which really is, it's like literally like a port of that nation is really like a pure creation of the counter-revolution, let me tell you. So they of course had the leader of the Dominican Republic. They had Noboa, raggedy ass Noboa, drug dealing Noboa from Ecuador. They had Bukele from El Salvador, also a drug dealer, also raggedy, also carrying out so many cursed libertarian experiments with El Salvador's economy. Like he tried to make Bitcoin the national currency in a country where like a lot of people don't have the internet or like smartphones. What are you talking about? Oh, anyway, so Bukele was there from Guyana. Ali was there from Honduras. The right-wing president that Trump helped get in there was there. Asfura, like it was the Libre party up against Asfura, the right-wing candidate last fall. And just as people in Honduras were going to vote, Trump tweeted like, I really want the right-wing guy to vote or there'll be big problems, big consequences. He's basically engaged in like open election interference in Honduras' election, and the right wing won as a consequence. So of course that wise guy was there. From Panama, Molino, from Paraguay, Peña, and from Trinidad and Tobago, the worst one to me. I don't know why she makes me so angry, but she's so trifling. Also instrumental in the U.S. invasion and kidnapping of Maduro and Celia Flores, the Persad BCI. Oh my God, Bissessar, I hate her. She just sucks, man. Like a brown woman going with these people. Oh my God, girl. I was just like all the most right-wing governments and figures from across Latin America and the Caribbean. And then in terms of U.S. officials who were present at the summit, the initiating meeting in the Shield of the Americas, we of course have Donald Trump. We have raggedy ass Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. We have coked out Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense. We have Kristi Noem, who was fired as the Secretary of Homeland Security, was named Special Envoy to the Shield of the Americas. It's supposed to be like a position that's like a lady coalition. Secretary of the Treasury, architect of so many. Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce. Jameson Greer, who I was not familiar with. He's the United States president, but his Wikipedia is wild. He is a Mormon. He served in like a colonial like judicial system during the U.S. occupation of Iraq, and he's also a trade lawyer. Like, I feel like he was made in a lab to be like a peak colonizer. It's wild. But Jameson Greer, I just put his Wikipedia in the chat. And then there's like a Republican senator from Ohio. His name is Bernie Moreno. He was born in Colombia. He grew up in Florida. Do I tell you, like the concentration of Gusanos, of right-wing diasporas coming from Florida? Oh my God, unmatched. But he's really been instrumental, or he has been pushing hard for more hostile engagement with the Petro government in Colombia, between the U.S. and the Colombian government. Like he's like, we need to get that guy out of there. We need like another right-wing puppet in place. We need the repression of the Colombian people. So he was like in the front row. So that is who was there, right-wing governments or right-wing political figures from the United States, from the Caribbean, from Central and South America. It came out of the postponement of the 10th Summit of the Americas. And it was essentially like Marco Rubio and Hegseth and Trump talking about how they're going to engage in a military war against quote unquote narco-terrorism in the Western Hemisphere. But really what they are trying to do is unify these right-wing forces from across Turtle Island in a military project of counter-revolution against progressive forces, masked as a war against drugs and a war on terror. Also very important to understand that the Shield of the Americas did not emerge from a vacuum. We know, of course, about Operation Southern Spear, which was initiated last year in September 2025, where they literally just started bombing fishing boats in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. They had were not charging people with crimes. They were not arresting anybody. They were literally just drone bombing fishing boats. They are still doing it. They have killed 150 people in 44 strikes. Again, none of those people have been charged with a crime. There's never been any evidence shown that any of those people were drug dealers at any point. And in fact, when there have been survivors of some of those 44 strikes, they are kidnapped, they are hospitalized, and then they have been returned to their home countries with grievous injuries and still no charges. So you can drone bomb the boat and kill people, but when people survive, you just let them go. You don't even try to make the case that they're a drug dealer. That's interesting. That to me indicates that these are all innocent men, innocent people that the US is drone bombing in fishing boats and has been for like 6 months. For 6 months. It's really wild. So Operation Southern Sphere, AKA just blowing up fishing boats, had been happening in the Western Hemisphere since last fall. Trinidad's support for Operation Southern Sphere was instrumental because it also included like the military, like the biggest buildup of U.S. military forces in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like they moved so many assets, so many warships, 15,000 troops to this region, all with the intent of carrying out Operation Absolute Resolve, aka the U.S. invasion of Venezuela, the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores, and the murder of 100 people, including 32 civilians. That was the whole point. And so Trinidad, it could not have happened without Trinidad's support. The really terrible, stupid lady that leads Trinidad politically supported this project. She was like, I hope they blow up more fishing boats, kill all the drug dealers. They were like killing Trini citizens. And she was like, yes, like just unquestionably supported it. She also allowed the US to install a radar system on Trinidad's land in order to do better surveillance on Venezuela in the buildup to the invasion that ended in the kidnapping of Maduro and Celia Flores. She allowed US aircraft to use Trinidad's civilian airport for military operations against Venezuela. And like I said, she provided strong political and rhetorical support to attacks on Trini and Caribbean civilians carried out by the US military. In addition to Trinidad providing that support to Operation Southern Sphere, other puppet governments that were at the Shield of the Americas, like the Dominican Republic, also provided material support. After one of the strikes on a fishing boat that killed people with like no charges, no evidence of them being drug dealers, the Navy of the Dominican Republic claimed that they helped the US recover the drugs after one of those strikes, providing completely manufactured evidence in support of the US government's claims that these people, which again had been charged with no crime, who has still no one has been charged with any crime related to these airstrikes, were actually carrying drugs. Like Trinidad was like, oh, we found this bag of cocaine. It's from the boat. No. Anyway, so this massive military buildup facilitated by these puppet governments ended in Operation Absolute Resolve. It started in November 2025, where the US government declared Tren de Agua a foreign terrorist organization and then accused Nicolas Maduro of being like the leader of Tren de Agua without evidence. They also were talking about this gang, Cartel del Soles, which was like made up. It was actually like a US kind of revolutionary project to try to destabilize Venezuela. They got corrupt like military leaders on the payroll, and then they made up this gang and they called it Cartel del Soles. That was also in there as well when they were like ginning up the case against Nicolas Maduro. And then also, of course, accused Maduro of supporting Hezbollah, of supporting Iran, basically just carried out a geopolitically motivated smear campaign to attempt to frame Nicolas Maduro as a narco-terrorist that was harmful to US national security interests, to justify the invasion of Nicolas Maduro and of Venezuela that ended in the kidnapping and, of course, the murder of 100 people in like a little bit less than an hour. I feel like that's not discussed enough. In addition to Operation Southern Sphere, or like this, like the airstrikes on the fishermen, the Trinidad support, the DR Navy support, the escalation of attacks on Venezuela and Maduro that were happening around this time, we also have to talk about how Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico, the colony of the United States, Puerto Rico, was used as a base of operations for this drastic U.S. military buildup in the Western Hemisphere, in Turtle Island. So in November 2025, shortly after Operation Southern Spear initiates and they're killing fishermen, Vieques, a number of U.S. military resources are deployed to Vieques, which had successfully closed a U.S. military base back in the early 2000s when the U.S. military tested a bomb and killed a random Puerto Rican worker, and the Puerto Rican people were like, "That's enough of that. What is wrong with y'all?" They had been organizing for 60 years to shut that down, and then that was the escalation they needed to do it for good. So the U.S. closed Vieques and removed its assets back in the early 2000s. But when Operation Southern Spear and this escalation of attacks on Venezuela initiated, they started moving military resources back to Vieques. They also started deploying resources to the Roosevelt Roads Naval Station in Aguadilla Ceiba in Puerto Rico as well. And then that's in November. And then in December of 2025, they stationed a fleet of F-35 planes at the Jose Aponte de la Torre Airport, which is a civilian airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico basically became the main base of operations for the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean as part of this attack on Venezuela and this attack on progressive forces throughout the hemisphere. And the Puerto Rican people did not want this, but because Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, because the governor of Puerto Rico and the state in power in Puerto Rico is a puppet of the U.S. empire, it was done against the will of the Cuban people. There have been, not the Cuban people, the Puerto Rican people. There have been ongoing protests all across the island, organized by many, many different Puerto Rican organizations that are interested in Puerto Rican independence, resisting this, fighting back against this, trying to make sure that those bases are closed and remain closed for good. But understand that Puerto Rico was instrumental in Operation Southern Spear, in Operation Absolute Resolve that ended in the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and Ciudad Flores, and is going to continue to be instrumental as the Shield of Americas continues to concretize this unity, this strategic alliance between the right-wing forces across our hemisphere. It's the logistical backbone of U.S. military operations here, which tells you that supporting Puerto Rico's national liberation is really, really key to resisting this strategy of counter-revolution. I also want to talk a little bit more about the folks that were there. I already talked about old girl from Trinidad. God, I hate her. But they were also all of them are clowns. All of them have their different angles, but I want to focus on a couple of them. Specifically, Bukele, who's Palestinian, a Palestinian Gusano. All diasporas have their ops. It is a consequence of neocolonialism and imperialism. They intentionally cultivate traitors among every colonized nation. And so the fact that Bukele is Palestinian is not any kind of statement on Palestinian people, just in case any confused people are watching. It's not a statement on Palestinian people. It's a statement on imperialism and neocolonialism and their capacity to exploit class struggles and contradictions within our nations to develop traitors among us. And so that's what he is. That's what he is. He's also a drug dealer with deep connections to the so-called cartels and gangs that the U.S. is claiming to be trying to fight with the Shield of the Americas, with Operation Southern Spear, with Operation Absolute Resolve. A lot of these puppets, like Bukele, like Noboa, like Asfura, who were at the Shield of the Americas summit, who are we are going to come together and take violent action against narco-terrorism. A lot of them are deeply implicated in the international drug trade, including the United States officials, like Rubio. So that's Bukele's story. But he also has become internationally famous for an extremely, extremely draconian and violent response to crime in El Salvador. You probably know Bukele because there's been a lot of news stories of the U.S. deporting undocumented people from the United States to El Salvador, to that prison Seco in El Salvador that Bukele is known for opening up. He has an extremely authoritarian approach to the war on crime, where there's strict restrictions on free speech, as a matter of fact, on freedom of movement, on even that tattoos you can get, and all kinds of restrictions on the people in El Salvador. But there has been a decrease in crime, and so he gets a lot of praise, even among people in Central and South America, for that impact, and also because of his relationship with the U.S. government. So he was there because he is interested in some people who are facing charges in the United States, who are members of gangs, who can implicate Bukele in connections to narco-terrorism, to the international drug trade. He wants to get those people back. And so he's working, trying to like get close up to the United States to make sure that they send those people back and they can't talk. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm going to drop an article about it from El País, talking about it, like oh my God. It's like all out in the open, but people don't be reading. It's really wild. And the other reason why he's getting close to Trump is because he is interested in increasing the internal repression in El Salvador and targeting the press that is asking questions, that is exposing him. And so it's going to be easier for him to target, to escalate internal repression in El Salvador with the support of the United States. And so that's another reason why he's cussing up to Trump. And it's not just him. A lot of these puppets are not only implicated in the international drug trade alongside the United States, but are also escalating internal repression and fascism and right-wing authoritarianism in their own nations. And so they're cozying up to the United States. They're cozying up to Trump in order to do that with the backing, the political, military, and economic backing of the US. Like, that's why old boy from Argentina was there. Like I said, he tanked Argentina's economy with a series of cursed libertarian experience, and the Trump administration bailed him out. If you get in close with the United States, if you get in close with Trump, it means you get dollars and guns. And that is what these puppets, these opportunists, these fascists from these nations, that's what they're interested in. That's why they're getting close. They have like their own interests in repressing left-wing forces throughout the hemisphere because it allows them to consolidate their power. But they are also interested in increasing repression internally within their own nations, and the US can help them do that. And so that's also why they're there. They have their own interests. Look at the class struggle, baby. So that's Bukele. Noboa, like I said, is a very, very similar situation. Noboa is the president of, and actually, so there's Operation Southern Spear, there's Operation Absolute Resolve, and there's also Operation, I'm trying to find the exact name, and sorry if I'm jumping around. I did like a lot of research for this show because I wanted to show y'all the connections. So I have a lot of notes. That's why you see me looking off screen. So Operation Total Extermination, which was initiated March 3rd, 2026, with a bomb on farmers, So 4 days before the Shield of the Americas, the United States collaborated on Operation Total on the homes and farms in Sucuquimbos, which is like a village on the border of and Colombia, a nation with a progressive leader that's being targeted by the United States. Ecuador and Colombia share a border. The military are carrying out bombings of civilians on the border between the Ecuador and Colombia. They're calling it Operation Total Extermination. They're saying it's about fighting drugs, but according to folks who were there on the ground, and this is an article from France 24, again, like not like a socialist or like left-wing outlet, just like straight up imperialist media outlet, just laying it out. So according to folks on the ground, the US and Ecuadorian militaries claimed that the bombing campaign was carried out against narco-terrorists, drug traffickers. But according to the people on the ground, it was peasants, it was small farmers who were bombed, and then the survivors were arrested and tortured by the Ecuadorian military. So this is a person who was there, a community leader, Vincent Garrido. He said, dead animals lay scattered, a lemon tree was charred, and an avocado tree had shed all its fruit. There was no sign of drug production or trafficking. Farmers lost everything and were abused. So not only in Operation Southern Spear, carried out by Shield of the Americas countries, are they bombing fishermen extrajudiciously in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, they have now extended that targeting of civilians in the name of fighting the war on terror and the war on drugs to villages in Ecuador, bombing peasants and farmers into oblivion, destroying everything they own, arresting them and torturing them and trying to convince them to confess the things they didn't do, and calling that also a battle in the war on drugs, in the war on terror. They're extending the tactics that they were carrying out in the ocean to land now, right on the border of Colombia. And again, this happened March 3rd, 4 days before the summit announcing the Shield of the Americas. So understand, though, like the Shield of the Americas was launched as a project at the summit in Florida on March 2nd, what Operation Southern Spear, Operation Absolute Resolve, and Operation Total Extermination show is that what the Shield of Americas is calling for, like this military alliance of right-wing forces across Turtle Island, it's already been happening. It's been happening for a while. They just put a name on it and a brand on it. Another thing that was announced the same day as the Shield of the Americas was the Americas Counter Cartel Coalition, or they call it the A3C, which is essentially the military arm of the Shield of the Americas, in which the 17 countries that are participating, all the ops and the United States, to expand intelligence sharing, maritime interdiction, basically like piracy, and using lethal military force against so-called criminal organizations. So they are announcing their intent to unite ideologically, unite politically, and unite militarily with military force to target nations, target their enemies across the Western Hemisphere, across Turtle Island. And again, it already happened. This is what produced the kidnapping of Celia Flores and Nicolas Maduro. This is what produced the deaths of over 150 fishermen across the Caribbean Sea, across the Pacific Ocean. This is also what produced that bombing of farmers on the border between Colombia and Ecuador. Like, it's all part of the same project that is unfolding in Nuestra America. They are trying to unite all of the right wing, all of the fascist forces in this hemisphere in a counter-revolution that spans across borders. They are coming for all of us, for Cuba, for Nicaragua, for Venezuela, for communists, for land defenders, for indigenous people. Like, it is a very old tactic that we are seeing unfold right now. It's just the latest version of it with the Shield of the Americas. The other thing that they are seeking to do, not only to target progressive forces, to target Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, to target leftists, to target communists, to target indigenous people, but they are also trying to drive a wedge between the progressive governments that exist here. So not just Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, but also Mexico, Colombia, Brazil to an extent. They are trying to divide and conquer, to isolate those countries, to pull support from them, and to try to weaken them one by one in order to change the government, to engage in regime change, and to get right-wing puppets in there. So this is really what it's all about. It's divide and conquer. It's unifying as the right wing to engage in violent repression against the rest of us. And it's an attempt to make sure that the Western Hemisphere remains in right-wing control, that communism cannot get an inroad here, that anti-imperialism cannot get an inroad here, and also make sure that China cannot get an inroad here. And the desire to deter China is probably like one of the most important factors in the development of this strategy right now by the Trump administration. And it's also bipartisan, by the way. Like, if you notice, every time there's an opportunity to try to like reel this back, to stop it, like the War Powers Resolution that would have like stopped Trump from initiating war on his own against Cuba, failed. It failed. Like, every time there's an opportunity to like pull it back, they come together across the aisle, Republican and Democrat, to make sure that it does not happen. To make sure that it does not happen. And if you all don't notice, even also notice, like, a lot of the Democratic officials that have like very strong criticisms of Trump for Iran or for Cuba are not talking about the Shield of the Americas, are not talking about this unifying of right-wing forces across the continent. And the fact of the matter is that there has been a bipartisan consensus to pursue this strategy, which means that even if Trump gets out of office and a Democrat comes in next, which may happen, who knows, maybe they'll pull it out at the last second, I guarantee you that next administration is not going to stop this either. They're going to continue it. So the Shield of the Americas is the military manifestation of the Dunroe Doctrine, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It is about capturing the Western Hemisphere, capturing Turtle Island for U.S. imperialism for the right wing. They are attempting to use the excuse of the war on drugs, the war on terror, out of control migration, security issues, to justify what they are doing, to frame it as national security concerns, but really all it is imperialism and colonization. So I mentioned that like a lot of this is about countering China, and that is correct. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has made a number of like favorable deals with nations across the world, including in the Western Hemisphere. And the US government cannot compete. Like they can't offer a better deal. They're interested in colonization and exploitation. They're not interested in engaging in deals as equals. And so they can't make a better deal than China. And so what they're doing instead is attempting to use their last remaining like card in the deck, their military hegemony, to pressure nations to give up on dealing with China and only deal with the United States. The Trump administration is slashing foreign assistance to nations all across the world, all across Turtle Island, but it's rewarding the puppets that agreed to unite with this military strategy of counter-revolution. That's why Argentina is getting money. That's why El Salvador is getting money. That's why Ecuador is getting military support, but Cuba is getting blockaded. Mexico is getting threats and tariffs. Brazil is getting tariffs because the U.S. has nothing to offer but force. So actually, as a matter of fact, like the U.S. successfully intimidated Panama into like abandoning a Chinese deal and giving it to a U.S. company instead. I think for like data infrastructure, like mobile phone infrastructure, something like that. But I was just reading about that the other day, that like Panama made a deal with China. The U.S. was like, absolutely not. That's our puppet. Don't deal with anybody but us. And they forced Panama to give up the deal. And now the deal is going to a U.S. company. Oh my God. And so they're just looking to control the resources of the Western Hemisphere, the resources of Turtle Island. They also want to control strategic assets like the Panama Canal, like the land and labor force of the Western Hemisphere. And they're extremely interested in a captive market for U.S. products, including oil and gas, because these puppets are willing to do trade, to do deals with the United States, even if those deals do not benefit their own populations. As long as the puppets' pockets get fat, they are going to do it. And the U.S. loves that. They want a captive market for inferior U.S. products, U.S. oil and gas, but also U.S. tech. The U.S. is extremely interested in pushing China out of any deals to develop the data structure infrastructure or the data information infrastructure of the nations of Turtle Island, of the nations of the Western Hemisphere, and instead get U.S. companies like Elon Musk's Starlink, as a matter of fact, to get those deals instead. The U.S. wants its like drastically inferior tech companies to have a captive market in the Western Hemisphere, because that allows the U.S. to enrich itself, but it also allows them to have control of strategic assets like the internet here, like people's like capacity to communicate here. The U.S. wants in the hands of U.S. companies, because as U.S. companies, again, enrich the U.S. ruling class, but also have a porous relationship with the U.S. government, which would allow the U.S. government to use that infrastructure to increase the repression of the people living in Turtle Island. It's all about control. It's all about colonial domination. Like that is what it's about. They cannot compete as equals. They cannot compete when the playing field is fair. And so instead, they're throwing their weight around. They're intimidating people. They're pushing China out. That's like one of the main goals. They're attacking the left to make sure that they have domination over this continent. That's what it's about. Let me see if there's anything I missed before I go to what to do about it. Oh yeah, so we talked about who was there. Bukele, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Argentina, all the ops of the Americas. I just want to touch on who was not there, who was targeted by these ops. We, of course, have Mexico, led by progressive leader Claudia Sheinbaum, who was excluded from the Shield of the Americas, even though Mexico has one of the largest economies in this part of the world. It also has very, very deep trade with the United States, excluded from this Shield of the Americas summit, and has also been threatened by Trump, has been intimidated by Trump, was blackmailed by the Trump administration into stopping sending oil to Cuba, and also rejected U.S. military intervention on U.S. soil, which pissed off Trump. Also excluded from the Shield of the Americas summit was Brazil, another very, very large economy in the Western Hemisphere, led by Lula da Silva. I'm talking too much. My throat is drying out. We're almost done. Who represents, again, over half of the region's gross domestic product. It completely shut out of the Shield of the Americas summit because Lula is a little bit too resistant to Trump's agenda. Also left out, of course, was Colombia, Petro, leftist. Oh my God. Petro is like, he's both like a disappointment and also like a source of hope, because he has been consistent about denouncing U.S. attacks on the Cuban Revolution. But when Operation Southern Spear and Operation Absolute Resolve were ramping up, Petro fixes his mouth to say that Venezuela is a dictatorship, that Maduro is a dictator. What are you doing? And then declined to help Venezuela militarily. First, he said he would do it. Then he had a meeting with Trump, and he was like, actually, never mind. So, yeah. But very, very wild thing is that to me, it kind of looks like Colombia might be next because, one, like I said, Ecuador and the U.S. military are carrying out bombings of villages on the border with Ecuador and Colombia. Two, U.S. troops recently started training in the jungles of Panama to get ready for jungle warfare. Three, we have the Trump administration declaring cartels in Colombia as foreign terrorist organizations as well. Like one is the Clan de Golfo, which was sanctioned by the Biden administration first, and then additional sanctions imposed by Trump. Then it was declared a foreign terrorist organization. The Petro government was engaged in peace talks with a number of right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia, including the Clan de Golfo. However, hold on, let me find my notes so I make sure I express it correctly. So the peace talks were held in Qatar in September 2025. They were ongoing as of December in 2025. Then the Trump administration put sanctions on Clan de Golfo, declared them a foreign terrorist organization, and then Petro met to meet with Trump in February 2026. Clan de Golfo was like, we see what time it is. We're just not going to do this. So they provisionally called off the peace talks. And to me, that looks like the U.S. successfully sabotaged those talks. And the really wild thing about Clan de Golfo and like the right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia in general, the Petros government is trying to reach a peace agreement with, is that the U.S. created them in the first place. The U.S. created that problem in the first place. And when I mean created the problem in the first place, is that the first paramilitary groups in Colombia, like the roots of Clan de Golfo and groups like them, were organized by the Colombian military on the recommendation of the U.S. government. And it should not be surprising if you know anything about U.S. intervention in Latin America, but it's really wild. Like they told the right-wing Colombian military to develop these groups to talk in Colombia. They them and supported them, and now they're declaring them terrorist organizations and saying Petro is mishandling them. Oh my God. So anyway, Petro was very, very silly for calling Maduro a dictator because I think that he might be next. Like the legal pretext is being established to say that he's the next narco trafficker. Oh my God. But they literally encouraged the Colombian military to develop these paramilitaries. Did that and opposing. So Colombia are being targeted by the Americas. They are not narco terrorists, not traffickers, but progressive governments and forces are all across the Western Hemisphere. I see the time, so let me move to the closing. Actually, last thing I'll say before I move to like what do we do about it? One is this is not new. I keep saying it's not a new strategy. Like the U.S. has tried to unite, either intentionally develop right-wing forces across Turtle Island in order to repress progressive movements, communist movements, anti-indigenous or indigenous movements, land defense movements. So they had like the School of the Americas, which is like an op factory for a long time, developing a lot of like the leaders and military figures that carried out campaigns of terror across the continent, across the Americas. But they also have established a coalition of ops before, and what was known as Operation Condor or Plan Condor, which was initiated in 1973 and extended through the 80s in a campaign of violent terrorism targeting progressive forces all across Turtle Island. Operation Condor featured the governments of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and later Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador, all coming together to say their highest ranking intelligence officials, US leaders, all coming together to say that we are going to unify our counter-revolutionary efforts to repress progressive forces across borders on this whole continent. They were even assassinating political leaders inside the United States, and the US government knew, and they still backed these right-wing governments that came together to do this. So I just want to read an excerpt from an article about Operation Condor. It says, The methods of landing helicopters in rural communities, burning and bombing homes, capturing and torturing their inhabitants recall the types of attacks and massacres carried out by these dictatorships to kill hundreds of thousands across South and Central America, but this time replacing the charge of communists with that of narco-terrorists. In many cases, these dictatorships and the CIA worked closely with the drug cartels. So understand the shield of the Americas strategy, the America's counter-cartel coalition strategy. These are not new things. These are rehashing a strategy that the US empire has deployed before. They are trying to unify the right-wing forces across all of Turtle Island to come for Cuba, to come for Venezuela, to come for Nicaragua, to come for all of us, which requires, in response, that we unify and organize to fight back, to resist it, to make sure that does not end in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people again, like Operation Condor did. So what do we do about it? Very quickly. First and foremost, like I said, Puerto Rico is the base of this drastic escalation of the U.S. military footprint in the Caribbean. Like they are deploying troops, resources, all these kind of things to Puerto Rico and using it as like a base, like a logistical base for this military escalation that is being concretized with the Shield of the Americas. So obviously, we need to support Puerto Rico's fight for independence, Puerto Rican national liberation, in order to resist this. Because if the Puerto Rican people have control of their own nation, the U.S. cannot use it as a giant military base, right? Right. So it seems like really, really key for Cuba Solidarity Forces, for anti-imperialist forces in the Americas to back Puerto Rican national liberation in any way that we can to make sure that Puerto Rico cannot be used in that way. That's also true for Haiti. Really, the entire island that has the nation of the Dominican Republic and the nation of Haiti on it, all of it's Haiti. All of it's Haiti. We should do a show about that. But the Dominican Republic has operated as a base of counter-revolution against the Haitian people, but also against the whole region, and it's happening here. But if Haiti was an independent, sovereign, and functioning nation, if the Haitian people had control of their own government, of their own land, of their own labor, it could not be used in that way. They would have something to say about it, right? And so we have to support Haitian national liberation, the end of U.S. intervention in Haiti, of imperialist intervention in Haiti, so the Haitian people can take their land back and join the fight against this right-wing counter-revolution that's spreading across our Americas. The other thing that's really important for us to do is to defend Cuba's sovereignty. And someone is asking in the chat if I can elaborate on the sanctions against folks who support Cuba. I talked about that at the top of the program, so I'm about to wrap it up. But like the first 30 minutes, I'm talking in detail about that. But understand, like this escalation of economic warfare is going to continue. They're trying to identify the most strategic targets for U.S. intervention, for U.S. sanctions in Cuba, and target those things specifically to turn up the screws, to turn up the pressure on the Cuban revolution, to increase the suffering of the Cuban people, to attempt to cause internal destabilization. So this latest executive order that came out on May 1st, the newest targets for sanctions announced earlier this week, is not going to be the end of it. Expect more escalation. It's very important for us to follow what is happening, to refuse to be intimidated, to continue to send brigades to Cuba, to send material aid to Cuba, and to spread the word about the U.S. attacks on Cuba, creating the situation on the ground on the island. It is not a failure of the revolution of the Cuban people. It is not a failure of communism. It's intentional attacks of the U.S. government against civilians, against Cuban people, that is causing the situation on the ground there. Like, keep it tight. Keep it tight. Like, I feel like every single time they escalate, some of y'all start slipping and talk about Cuba's problems. And I'm like, every problem that Cuba has can be solved by the Cuban people, except the blockade. The blockade is us. We have to organize to fight it. So stay focused. Don't get caught slipping. Don't provide narrative cover to U.S. attacks on Cuba. The other really important thing for us to do in terms of countering the Shield of the Americas is to build counter coalitions. They can have a gathering of the ops of the Americas. We can have many, many gatherings of the progressive forces of the Americas. We have to come together across borders, unite our struggles, understand none of us is fighting in a silo by ourselves. It's all connected. It's all the same enemy. We have to defend each other. We have to follow the example of the Cuban people, of the Cuban Revolution. It's very intentional strategy of solidarity and internationalism. Like, that is how Cuba has been able to survive socialist economic development, political development, and internationalism, international solidarity. And we can do the same thing. If we know that Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil are the targets, then we have to support them in resisting U.S. pressure. We must support the governments of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia in resisting U.S. imperialist pressure. We also have to unite with the social justice and progressive and left forces in those nations. We have the U.S. contingent to the 9th Continental Gathering in solidarity with Cuba and Mexico City. Last fall, we made a number of really important connections in that summit that are still being built to this day. We need more of that work. We must connect across borders. We must build a transnational anti-imperialist movement to counter the Shield of the Americas and similar right-wing strategies. That was a lot, and I'm almost out of time. So thank you for bearing with me. I hope you learned some stuff. And now I'm going to move to the NNOC updates and the closing so I can end somewhat on time. It's 2:30 now. I'm going to give myself 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, so in terms of what's going on around the NNOC, the May Day Brigade is still in Cuba, but is wrapping up shortly. I've been playing clips on the ground from those comrades. It looks incredible. Again, they brought over $600,000 in material aid on Cuba to break that blockade. Shout out to those comrades. Shout out to the Caravan for Cuba, organized for the Action for Cuba committees. My co-hosts, Yesenia and Ermia, are going to be back hopefully next week. And we'll get a full report back from them from what happened on the May Day Brigade and lessons and things to build upon. We also have the next brigade coming up, organized by the National Network on Cuba and the Centenary Brigade, one of my political homes. The Centenary of Fidel Brigade, we're bringing 150 people to Cuba to commemorate Fidel Castro's 100th birthday, to bring even more material aid, to break the blockade, and to also strengthen movements for justice in the United States. So we're launching a national fundraiser soon. Stay tuned for that on NNOC and VB platforms, and please support us. Help us raise funds for material aid and for scholarships for brigadistas. In terms of what's going on in the National Network on Cuba, we have our bylaws, our updated draft bylaws, incorporating the input from our process of feedback and debate, which has been taking place over the past year and a half. We just put out that final drafts at the beginning of May. And so the member organizations of the NNOC have it. And in our spring meeting happening on Saturday, May 30th from 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be having a vote on whether we're going to adopt those new bylaws for the National Network on Cuba. Some of the changes in those new bylaws, including making the NNOC an explicitly anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist organization. It includes more detail about what it means to be an individual member of the NNOC. It includes a code of conduct for engaging each other as comrades and building a stronger and more unified Cuba solidarity movement, as well as a grievance process rooted in the principles of transformative justice to address it when we fall short of our code of conduct, of our community agreement. And it also includes some new structures for leading areas of work in the National Cuba Solidarity Movement, including the brigades. So again, that draft has been distributed to the member organizations of the NNOC. The vote on the draft is happening at our spring summer meeting on May 30th. And there's more information going on to the NNOC member org shortly about how to participate in that spring meeting. And we hope to see you there. Excuse me. So just to wrap it up, this has been the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast. My name is Onyesanwu Chatoye. I am an organizer with the Centenary Brigade. I'm one of the 5 elected co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba. I do this program alongside my comrades Yesenia and Ermia every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, which means next Friday we will be back, hopefully, with a report back on the ground from the International May Day Brigade. But I want to say thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your comments. And thank you so much for your organized action and support of the Cuban Revolution. We cannot panic in this moment, even as the U.S. attacks escalate, even as the saber rattling continues from Trump. We must stay focused, we must stay scientific, and we must stay organized and unified and ready for revolution. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Eran las 3 de la mañana, 3 de enero en el calendario. Caracas dormía tranquila bajo su manto diario, pero el cielo no trajo sol, trajo un ruido de metal y en Fuerte Tiuna se rompió el silencio habitual. No fueron truenos de lluvia, fueron botas extranjeras que cruzaron sin permiso nuestras líneas y fronteras. La noticia corre como pólvora, la pantalla se congela. Se han llevado al presidente, hay fuego en Venezuela. ¡Liberen a Nicolás! quita una parte del mapa, mientras la garra del norte su sentencia destapa. Dicen que va hacia el norte sobre el mar prisionero, en las entrañas de acero de un buque extranjero. Que el mundo se detenga, que nadie quede mudo, hoy la historia se parte. Liberen a Maduro. Hoy en Moscú escuchas el eco en el Caribe. Si cae un socio el equilibrio no sobrevive. Pekín levanta la vista, el dragón debe mirar que las flotas del imperio han vuelto a navegar. Hermano en La Habana, sandinista en Nicaragua, saben que esta misma lluvia mañana será su agua. Si hoy tocan a uno y lo sacan de su cama, mañana su justicia incendiará toda la rama. Dicen que el Iwo Jima navega con la presa, que van rumbo a Nueva York a servirlo en la mesa. Trump firma la orden, Petro mira con espanto. ¿Es justicia o es venganza lo que cubre con su manto? Las bombas en la Carlota dejaron su marca en el suelo. Un pájaro de hierro se lo llevó en pleno vuelo. Para el que celebra en Miami, para el que llora en el barrio, esto no es solo un hombre, es un cambio de escenario. La soberanía sangra cuando el juez es el verdugo y la libertad no nace bajo la sombra del yugo. Venezolano despierta, sea cual sea tu color. Hoy tu tierra fue pisada por la bota del invasor. El mundo aguanta la respiración, la moneda está en el aire. Nadie sabe el costo, nadie sabe el desaire. Desde el sur hasta el oriente, el mensaje es duro. Me respetan a los pueblos, me liberen a Maduro. Me respetan a los pueblos, me liberen a Maduro.